This video will focus on the Ukrainian Soviet scientist, designer of rocket and space systems, Sergei Korolev. Sergei Pavlovich Korolev was born on January 12, 1907 in the city of Zhytomyr in the family of a teacher Pavel Yakovlevich Korolev and the daughter of a merchant Maria Nikolaevna Moskalenko. He is the creator of the rocket and space technology of the Soviet Union. He studied from 1924 at the Kiev Polytechnic Institute, 1926 transferred to the Moscow Higher Technical School. On June 27, 1938, he was arrested as an accomplice of the counter-revolutionary Trotskyist organization. According to some reports, he was tortured, his jaw was broken. On September 25, 1938, he was the first on the list to be shot. 2 days later he was sentenced to 10 years of camps and 5 years of imprisonment. In 1944 he was released and in 1957 he was acquitted due to lack of corpus delicti. On September 8, he flew to Berlin to study the captured rocket technology. Later, there he established a rocket institute with the Korolev as chief engineer. In 1948, Korolev successfully tested the R-1 rocket, which is an analog of the B-2, and in 1950 he put it into operation. In 1956, the R-7 three-stage missile was created, the first intercontinental ballistic missile. On October 4, 1957, the first artificial Earth satellite in the history of mankind was launched into near-Earth orbit. In 1959, 3 automatic stations were created and launched on a moon. Luna 1 flew near the moons, registered the solar wind for the first time. Luna 2, for the first time in the world, made a flight from Earth on another space body. Luna 3, for the first time performed feedback from the Moon. About 70% of the Moon's feedback was captured. Subsequently, Korolev began developing a more advanced lunar apparatus for the Lunar Panorama Object E6.
In 1957, chief designer Sergei Pavlovich Korolev was given the task of preparing dogs for a one-day orbital flight with the possibility of returning back in a descent vehicle. For this, 12 dogs were selected. The initial selection was carried out according to a special method. The dogs had to weigh up to 6 kilograms, up to 35 centimeters high, and aged from 2 to 6 years. August 19, 1960 at 11:44 Moscow time, the second spacecraft satellite was successfully launched from the Launch Complex No. 1. The cockpit, in which Belka and Strelka were, was placed in the ship 2 hours before the start. Sergei Pavlovich Korolev personally supervised the preparation of the spacecraft for launch. During the launch and climb, the dogs showed very rapid breathing and pulse, but when the spacecraft was launched into orbit, they calmed down. Several months after the flight, Strelka gave birth to healthy offspring of 6 puppies. Belka and Strelka lived at the State Research and Testing Institute of Aviation and Space Medicine and died at a ripe old age. Currently, their stuffed animals are in the Memorial Museum of Cosmonautics in Moscow. On April 2, 1961, Korolev launched the first man into space, Yuri Gagarin, on his first manned spacecraft Vostok 1. The ship around the Earth made only one turn because no one knew how the human body would behave in weightlessness conditions. For the launch of the first man into space and his training, Korolev was awarded the title of Hero of Socialist Labor for the second time. From 12 to the 13th of October 1964 on the more complex spacecraft, Voskhod, in space there was a crew of 3 people of various specialties, the commander of the ship, The flight engineer and the doctor. March 18, 1965, cosmonaut Leonov for the first time in history leaves the VOSKHOD-2 spacecraft into open space. Sergei Korolev's N-1 rocket, with a height of 105.3 meters and a diameter at the base of 17.0 and 15.6 meters, was originally intended to launch a heavy, 75T, orbital station into near-Earth orbit with the prospect of ensuring the assembly of a heavy interplanetary spacecraft for flights to Venus and Mars. With the adoption of the decision to include the USSR in the so-called lunar race, to organize a manned flight to the lunar surface and return it back, the N-1 program was forced and became a carrier for the expeditionary spacecraft L-3 in the N-1L-3 complex of the Soviet Lunar Landing Manned Program. All 4 test launches of the N-1 were unsuccessful during the first stage of the operation. The main problem was a defective engine, not a poorly designed rocket. Also officially closed a Project N-1. The entire manned lunar program, including the H-1 carrier, was strictly classified and became public only in 1989. Mars. The famous lunar rocket N-1 at the time of the birth of the idea and draft designs was not lunar, but Martian. Its main task was to deliver the blocks into orbit from which the heavy interplanetary ship, TMK, was assembled. The TMK development group, which included Bugrov, by 1964 managed to reduce the ship's design launch weight to 378 tons. Accordingly, 4 launches of the N-1 rocket would be quite enough to assemble TMK in orbit. Everything was thought out. The same Bugrov proposed and developed an ingenious scheme of aerodynamic braking of the spacecraft in the atmosphere of Mars, which, in fact, made it possible to drastically reduce its starting weight and reduce the assembly time to 1 year. A group of specialists was engaged in the development of a closed biological and technical complex, designed to ensure the circulation of substances consumed and released by the crew, according to the scheme existing in terrestrial conditions. A greenhouse was designed where it was supposed to grow potatoes, sugar beets, rice, legumes, cabbage, carrots, lettuce and other crops. The plants were planned to be placed on compact racks, of course, not in the ground, but on hydroponics, while the roots were placed in special capsules, to which a nutrient solution is supplied. By 1964, Korolev's impact was much greater. According to Bugrov's calculations, the project for preparing a flight to Mars was completed by on half. For its full implementation, little was needed, normal planned work without rush jobs and sharp turns. However, everything happened exactly the opposite. In the same 1964, the leadership of the USSR, impressed by the success of the Americans in promoting the lunar program, gave the task to get ahead of the States on the Moon. The Mars expedition at first stalled, and after the death of Korolev in 1966 it stalled altogether. The chance to put a manned flight to Mars in the big race was irretrievably missed. Nobel Prize according to her. When Moscow met Yuri Gagarin after his space flight, her comrades in the crowd asked, "It would be interesting to know who is this chief designer who launched Gagarin into space?" And I so wanted to say that this was my father, but I could not do this, because he strictly forbade me to say what he was doing, she said. Korolev said that due to secrecy, Her father did not receive the Nobel Prize twice, in 1957, for the launch of the first satellite, and in 1961, for the flight of Gagarin, Interfax reports. Because when the Nobel Prize Committee appealed to our government, Khrushchev replied that the creator of the new technology in our country is the entire nation. So we cannot give the name of the chief designer, she stressed. According to her, Korolev said that we are miners, we are deep underground, no one sees us and no one knows. Death on January 14, 1966, during the operation, Korolev started bleeding. It was not possible to stop it by removing the polyps. It was decided to open the abdominal cavity. This was not part of the original surgery plan and was not prepared in advance by the anesthesiologists. How the patient's heart would react to general anesthesia, no one could say, in the hospital. Korolev had never been given an ECG. When they began to approach the bleeding site, they found a tumor the size of a fist. It was a sarcoma, a malignant tumor. Petrovsky decided to remove the sarcoma. At the same time, part of the rectum was removed. The remainder had to be removed through the peritoneum. Due to the trauma of the jaws, broken during interrogations back in the 1930s. Korolev could not open his mouth wide enough, which made it difficult to intubate the trachea. He was unable to properly insert the breathing tube into the trachea. Cardiac arrest occurred 30 minutes after the end of the operation, while still on the operating table. This is an amazing man who commanded and developed all the rocketry of the USSR. He could become great and famous during his lifetime if he worked for America, but he chose to be in the shadows and create his own space camp. Thanks for watching, like it, subscribe to my channel and stay up to date with space.